What did the wife of the man they called the Butcher of Prague actually do with her waking hours? While Reinhard Heydrich spent his days drafting the machinery of the Holocaust, chairing the Wannsee Conference, and terrorizing occupied Czechoslovakia from behind a desk in Prague Castle, his wife Lina was living an entirely different life just a few miles away. One filled with croquet matches, household budgets, riding lessons, garden produce, and increasingly, the forced labor of concentration camp prisoners toiling on her lawn. She was not a passive figure hiding in her husband's shadow. She was, by his own admission, the woman who ran their household with total authority, the one who pushed him toward the SS in the first place, and the one who, decades after his death, still insisted the Holocaust was little more than a fairy tale. So what exactly filled her days, from a childhood on a windswept Baltic island to a widowhood spent managing slave laborers on a stolen Bohemian estate, to an old age spent running a seaside inn for former SS men? In this video, we will find out. So, without further ado, let's start at the beginning. Lina Matilda von Osten was born on the 14th of June 1911 on the small German island of Fehmarn, a windswept spit of land in the Baltic Sea, separated from the mainland by a narrow strait and lying just off the coast of Denmark. Her father, Jürgen von Osten, worked as a village schoolteacher and claimed minor aristocratic lineage, a claim that mattered enormously to a family clinging to social status in the economically ravaged years following the First World War. Her mother, Matilda Emilie Hiss, ran the household in the manner typical of the era, and young Lina grew up in a world of modest means but inflated pretensions, surrounded by the low hills, sheep pastures and fishing villages of an island that would remain for her entire life her true emotional home. Fehmarn was not a place of grand estates or political intrigue. It was a place of rowing clubs, church socials and long walks along the coast, and it was here that Lina developed the athletic, outdoorsy temperament that would define her long before she ever heard the name Heydrich. As a teenager, Lina spent her days much as any young woman of her background might have, attending school, participating in the local rowing club, and absorbing the political anxieties of a Germany reeling from hyperinflation, unemployment, and national humiliation. Her brother Hans had joined the Sturmabteilung, the Nazi Party's brown-shirted paramilitary wing, and his enthusiasm for the movement rubbed off on his younger sister. In 1929, at the age of 18, Lina attended a political rally where Adolf Hitler himself delivered a speech. Whatever she heard that day left a deep impression. Shortly afterwards, she joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, receiving the membership number 1,201,380, a number that placed her among the party's true believers years before it would seize power, and 2 full years before she would even meet the man who would make her name infamous. Her days at this point were spent in the ordinary rhythms of small-town German youth, rowing on the water, attending dances, and increasingly absorbing the Völkisch nationalism that swept through her generation like a fever. Everything changed on the 6th of December 1930. Lina, then 19 years old, attended a ball hosted by a rowing club in the northern German port city of Kiel. There she met a tall, blonde naval lieutenant named Reinhard Heydrich, a signals officer serving aboard the training ship Berlin. The attraction was immediate and overwhelming. Within days, the two were inseparable, and on the 18th of December, just 12 days after their first meeting, they announced their engagement. It was a whirlwind that would have seemed romantic had it not concealed a scandal already in motion. Heydrich, it turned out, had been informally promised to another woman, the daughter of a well-connected shipbuilder with ties to the German Navy's senior leadership, and when that spurned woman's family learned of the sudden engagement to Lina, they lodged a formal complaint. A naval court of honor was convened in the spring of 1931 to examine Heydrich's conduct, and in April of that year, on the recommendation of Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, he was dismissed from the Navy for conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. Lina, in later interviews, dismissed Raeder as a petty and moralistic little man for the ruling, but the damage was done. At 26 years old, with the Depression at its brutal height, Reinhard Heydrich suddenly had no career, no income, and no clear future. What did Lina do in the face of this crisis? She acted. It was Lina who suggested that Reinhard look into the fledgling Schutzstaffel, the SS, as an alternative path, aware through her own party connections that Heinrich Himmler was quietly building up a security and intelligence apparatus within the movement. A family friend, Karl von Eberstein, arranged an introduction, though Himmler nearly cancelled the meeting at the last minute. According to later accounts, Lina simply ignored the cancellation message, packed her fiancé's suitcase herself and put him on a train to Munich anyway. Eberstein met Heydrich at the station and delivered him to Himmler, who asked the former naval officer to sketch out his ideas for an SS intelligence service on the spot. Himmler was so impressed with what he heard that he hired Heydrich immediately, appointing him head of what would become the Sicherheitsdienst, or SD, the intelligence and security branch of the SS. It was a decision that would eventually place the machinery of the final solution in Heydrich's hands, and it had been set in motion in no small part by his fiancée's stubborn refusal to let a cancelled appointment end his career before it began. Heydrich and Lina married on the 26th of December 1931 in a small church in Grossenbrode, not far from her childhood island. For the newlywed Lina, married life meant adjusting to the itinerant existence of an SS officer's wife. Heydrich was posted first to Munich, where he had briefly lived alone in a boarding house reserved for unmarried SS men, and the young couple's early days together were spent establishing a household on a shoestring budget, while Reinhard worked to build his fledgling intelligence service almost from nothing, reportedly starting with little more than a shoebox of index cards on the party's internal enemies. Lina, for her part, spent these early years doing what countless young wives of ambitious men have always done: managing a household with limited resources, adapting to frequent moves, and quietly absorbing the political culture of the organization her husband now served. She would later claim that Reinhard never once read Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, a detail she offered as evidence of his supposed lack of ideological fervour, though such claims must be weighed against the reality of what the SD and the SS were built to accomplish, and against her own membership in the party years before she ever met him. The couple's family grew quickly. Their first son, Klaus, was born on the 17th of June, 1933, followed by a second son, Haida, on the 23rd of December, 1934. By this point, Heydrich's star was rising rapidly within the Nazi security apparatus. In 1934, he was placed in charge of the Gestapo alongside his existing SD duties, and in 1936, he took command of the newly unified security police, merging the Gestapo with the criminal police, or Kripo. Each promotion meant more responsibility, more hours away from home, and more frequent relocations for Lina and the growing family, first through Munich, then to Berlin, as the centre of Nazi power. Lina's daily existence during these years increasingly took on the shape it would keep for the rest of her married life. She ran the household, managed domestic staff, oversaw the raising of the children, and organised the family's social calendar, while her husband disappeared for long stretches into a world of files, interrogations, and increasingly murderous policy planning that she would later insist she knew nothing about. What did a typical day look like for Lina Heydrich in these years as a rising SD wife in Berlin? Later in life, she offered a detailed, almost admiring account of her husband's punishing schedule, one that reveals as much about her own daily rhythms as his. She recalled that Reinhard began his mornings while being shaved, poring over the overnight intelligence reports that had accumulated during the night. Breakfast was hurried, and during the 30-minute drive to his office, he would continue reading files in the back of the car. He never allowed his staff a moment's rest, she said, adding that he had lost all sense of ordinary human measure, hurrying subordinates constantly and expecting from everyone the same unconditional devotion to duty that consumed his own existence. While Reinhard vanished into this world of files and fear, Lina's days ran on an entirely different clock, managing meals, tending to sick children, corresponding with tradesmen, and maintaining the household's public face as the family of an increasingly important SS officer. She was, in effect, running a small domestic empire that existed in parallel to her husband's growing empire of terror, and later, Reinhard himself would half-jokingly acknowledge the arrangement, remarking that Lina directed and administered her own private Reich within their home. Social life consumed a considerable portion of Lina's time as well, As her husband's rank climbed, so too did the expectation that she participate in the elaborate social rituals of the SS elite, attending functions, hosting dinners for Reinhard's colleagues and their wives, and navigating the petty rivalries and status anxieties that defined the wives' circles of the Third Reich's leadership. She later admitted to disliking Himmler's wife intensely, a sentiment apparently returned in kind, and she cultivated a reputation among her peers as sharp-tongued, opinionated, and entirely unafraid to voice her views, even in a social world that generally expected women to remain decorative and silent. Away from these formal obligations, Lina's genuine passions ran toward horseback riding, croquet, and the outdoor pursuits she had grown up with on Fehmarn. Reinhard shared some of these enthusiasms when he was home, and biographers who later interviewed Lina extensively described a domestic picture strikingly at odds with his public reputation. A husband who loved riding and croquet, who kept up long, gossipy correspondence with his mother-in-law about entirely banal subjects, and who, according to his wife at least, showed no outward sign of the moral catastrophe he was engineering during his working hours. But what did Lina actually know about that working world? This question would come to define the rest of her life, long after the war ended and long after her husband was dead. She always insisted that she never interfered with his work and never truly understood its details, that she simply ran the house and raised the children, while Reinhard handled matters of state that were entirely beyond her sphere. Yet, the timeline complicates this claim of innocence considerably. By 1939, Heydrich had engineered the merger of the SD, the Gestapo, and the Kripo into the newly formed Reich Security Main Office, an organization that would eventually employ roughly 100,000 people and serve as the administrative backbone of the Holocaust. The strain of these expanding responsibilities took a serious toll on the Heydrich marriage during the late 1930s. Reinhard's long absences, his notorious womanizing, and the sheer intensity of his work left Lina managing the household virtually alone for extended stretches, and the couple reportedly came close to divorce during this period. Whatever the precise cause of the rift, the marriage survived, and the couple reconciled in time to welcome a third child, a daughter named Silke, born on the 9th of April, 1939. Reinhard, by all accounts, doted on his infant daughter, proudly showing her off to colleagues and developing what those close to the family described as a genuinely close relationship with her, a small human detail that sits uneasily alongside everything else historians now know about the man. How did Lina spend her days once the war began in September of 1939? For the first 2 years of the conflict, her life continued along much the same lines as before, anchored in Berlin, managing a household now stretched across 3 children, and increasingly aware that her husband's responsibilities had taken on a darker and more consequential character. Heydrich was now overseeing the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that followed the German army into Poland and later the Soviet Union, murdering Jews, communists, and other perceived enemies of the Reich by the tens of thousands. On the 31st of July 1941, Hermann Göring formally tasked Heydrich with preparing a comprehensive plan for what the regime euphemistically called the final solution of the Jewish question, an order that would culminate 6 months later in the infamous Wannsee Conference of the 20th of January 1942, where Heydrich presided over a meeting of senior bureaucrats to coordinate the logistics of genocide across occupied Europe. Whatever Lina's precise awareness of these developments, her own account of her daily routine during this period remained remarkably domestic in character, overseeing 3 young children, managing servants, and preparing for what would become the most dramatic relocation of her married life, a move that would place her, quite literally, inside the machinery of Nazi occupation. In September of 1941, Hitler appointed Reinhard Heydrich as acting Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, effectively making him the supreme German authority over occupied Czechoslovakia, tasked with crushing resistance and accelerating the deportation of the region's Jewish population. The appointment came with a residence befitting the role, the Lower Castle, or Dolny Zamek, at Panenské Břežany, a neoclassical chateau roughly 20 kilometers north of Prague. The property had a grim provenance even before the Heydrichs arrived. It had originally belonged to Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer, a wealthy Jewish sugar industrialist who fled Czechoslovakia after the Nazi occupation of 1939, and whose confiscated art collection would later become the subject of one of the most famous restitution battles in modern history. Before Heydrich moved in, the estate had served as the residence of his predecessor as Reich Protector, Konstantin von Neurath, and the family's new neighbour in the neighbouring Upper Castle was Karl Hermann Frank, the brutal higher SS and police leader for Bohemia and Moravia. For Lina, the move to Panenské Břežany meant stepping into a life of genuine aristocratic grandeur, however ill-gotten. The estate's neoclassical grounds, sweeping lawns and elaborate interiors stood in dramatic contrast to the modest schoolteacher's cottage on Fehmarn, where Lina had spent her own childhood, and the transformation in her material circumstances over the span of a single decade, from provincial schoolgirl to chatelaine of a confiscated Bohemian manor house, mirrored the equally dramatic transformation in her husband's own fortunes during those same 10 years, rising from a disgraced, unemployed former naval officer to the second most feared man in the entire apparatus of Nazi terror, answerable only to Himmler and, above him, to Hitler himself. The estate offered separate living quarters for the family within its expansive structure, complete with an elaborate Art Deco interior staircase, sprawling grounds, and a level of domestic stuff far beyond anything she had commanded in Berlin. What did her days look like now? Every morning, Reinhard would depart by chauffeured car for the 20-kilometre commute into Prague, along a route that German officials nicknamed Heydrich's Curve, a road that would later gain grim historical significance as the site of his assassination. With her husband gone for the day, and often deep into the evening, Lina settled into the role of chatelaine, managing an estate staff, overseeing the upbringing of Klaus, Heider, and Silke amid the surroundings of a stolen Bohemian manor house, and adapting to a domestic routine that blended the privileges of occupation with the isolation of life in a country that despised its German rulers. Survivors and household staff who later testified about conditions at the estate described a woman firmly and often harshly in command of her domestic sphere, someone who expected obedience from those beneath her, whether they were Czech domestic staff or, in the years soon to follow, forced labourers drawn from concentration camps. The estate's neoclassical grounds, sweeping lawns, and elaborate interiors stood in dramatic contrast to the modest schoolteacher's cottage on Fehmarn, where Lena had spent her own childhood, and the transformation in her material circumstances over the span of a single decade, from provincial schoolgirl to chatelaine of a confiscated Bohemian manor house, mirrored the equally dramatic transformation in her husband's own fortunes during those same 10 years, rising from a disgraced, unemployed former naval officer to the second most feared man in the entire apparatus of Nazi terror, answerable only to Himmler, and above him to Hitler himself. What did her mornings at Panenské Břežany actually consist of in practical terms? She woke, by most accounts, relatively early, coordinating breakfast for the children and overseeing the household staff's preparation of the day's meals before her husband departed for his commute into Prague. With Reinhard gone for the bulk of each day, Lina's late mornings and afternoons filled with the practical business of managing a large estate, meetings with household staff, correspondence, attention to the children's lessons and activities, and, as the war progressed, increasing involvement in the agricultural and forestry operations that helped sustain the property. Evenings, when Reinhard returned from Prague, brought a shift toward family time, dinner together when his schedule permitted it, and the particular blend of domestic warmth and unspoken menace that seems to have characterized so much of the Heydrich household's daily rhythm during these years in occupied Czechoslovakia. Lina's relationship with the wider culture of Nazi occupation in Prague also deepened during this period. She attended official functions alongside her husband, entertained visiting dignitaries from Berlin, and increasingly found herself moving within a small, insular community of German occupation officials and their families, cut off from the Czech population around them by language, ideology, and mutual hostility. It was, in her own later telling, something close to an idyllic existence, an insulated and privileged life that she would famously describe to a biographer decades afterward as feeling like a fairy tale land, one in which she herself felt like a princess. That characterization, offered so many years after the fact, and with full knowledge of what her husband's administration had done to the people of Bohemia and Moravia, remains one of the most jarring pieces of testimony to emerge from anyone connected to the senior leadership of the Third Reich, a reminder of just how completely some of the regime's beneficiaries were able to compartmentalize privilege from atrocity. But how long could that fairy tale possibly last? Reinhard Heydrich had made himself one of the most feared and hated men in occupied Europe, presiding over mass executions of Czech resistance figures, intensifying the deportation of Jews from the Protectorate to ghettos and camps further east, and governing with such calculated brutality that the Czechoslovak government in exile in London made his assassination a matter of the highest strategic priority. On the 27th of May 1942, a team of British-trained Czech and Slovak soldiers, part of an operation codenamed Anthropoid, ambushed Heydrich's car along the very curve he travelled every morning on his commute from Panenské Břežany. When his submachine gun jammed, one of the attackers, Jan Kubiš, hurled a modified anti-tank grenade at the vehicle instead. The explosion tore through the car's side, driving fragments of shrapnel, upholstery and horsehair deep into Heydrich's body. He was rushed to a nearby hospital, and for several days his condition appeared to stabilize enough that doctors were cautiously optimistic about his recovery. But sepsis set in, poisoning his blood, and on the 4th of June 1942, Reinhard Heydrich died of the resulting complications. He was 38 years old, and Lina, 30 years old herself, was suddenly a widow with 3 young children, 1 month away from giving birth to a 4th. The Nazi regime turned Heydrich's death into a spectacle of state mourning. Hitler himself travelled to Prague to view the body and later presided over an elaborate funeral in Berlin, awarding Heydrich the highest posthumous honours the Reich could bestow, and using the assassination as a pretext to unleash one of the most savage reprisal campaigns of the entire occupation, one that would culminate in the annihilation of the Czech village of Lidis, where every adult male was executed and the settlement itself razed to the ground. Lina attended these state ceremonies as the grieving widow of a fallen hero of the Reich, a role thrust upon her at the very moment her own world had been shattered. What must her days have looked like in those weeks, caught between the theatrical grief of a regime eager to make political capital out of her husband's death and the very real grief of a woman who had lost her partner of 11 years while carrying his 4th child? 6 weeks after Reinhard's death, on the 23rd of July 1942, Lina gave birth to a daughter, whom she named Marte. Those who knew the family remarked that the infant bore a striking resemblance to her late father, a small and painful echo of the man whose funeral Lina had so recently attended. In the immediate aftermath of her husband's death, Lina faced a series of urgent practical decisions about the family's future. She began liquidating some of the family's Berlin area properties, selling the house in the capital as well as a hunting lodge near Nauen, converting these ill-gotten wartime acquisitions into liquid capital that would help sustain the family in the uncertain years ahead. Yet, even as she disposed of some properties, she made a deliberate decision to hold on to the grandest prize of all, the lower castle at Panenské Břežany itself. In recognition of Reinhard's service to the Nazi state, Hitler formally gifted the estate to Lina outright, and the property took on a new, distinctly Germanized name in official correspondence, Jungfern Břechan. It was supposed to remain in Heydrich family hands in perpetuity, a monument to a fallen hero of National Socialism, and for the next 3 years it would become the stage for the strangest and darkest chapter of Lina Heydrich's entire life. One in which the woman who had spent her mornings managing servants and hosting dinner parties would instead spend them presiding over a private workforce of slave labourers, drawn directly from the concentration camp system her husband had helped build. Heinrich Himmler, ever conscious of the political value of the Heydrich name, took on an informal role as Lina's legal guardian in the wake of her husband's death, arranging for her financial security and, in theory, looking after the interests of the widow and her 4 children. But Himmler quickly discovered that Lina had no intention of retreating into quiet, respectable mourning. She remained in Czechoslovakia rather than returning immediately to Germany, and she ran her 32-room country villa with an energy and visibility that Himmler found distinctly unwelcome. According to accounts drawn from those who observed her during this period, she led such an active and public life at Jungfern Břechan, entertaining, corresponding, and involving herself in local affairs, that Himmler eventually felt compelled to reprimand her directly for behaving like what he described, with evident distaste, as a politicizing widow, a woman who refused to fade quietly into the background now that her usefulness to the regime as an ornamental wife had technically expired. What then did Lina's typical day at Jungfern Břechan actually involve during these years of widowhood? Mornings began early on the estate, with a housekeeping staff to direct, 4 children ranging from infancy to age 9 to oversee, and the practical business of running a substantial agricultural and forestry operation to attend to. The grounds were extensive, encompassing orchards, vegetable gardens, forested parcels, and open farmland, all of it cultivated to produce food and income that helped underwrite the enormous cost of maintaining a 32-room chateau in the middle of a war. Lina took a hands-on role in directing this agricultural enterprise, walking the grounds, inspecting the produce, and making decisions about planting, harvesting, and the allocation of labour, much of which was, by this point, no longer voluntary. Beginning in 1942, Himmler arranged for a workforce of approximately 30 Jewish prisoners from the Theresienstadt ghetto to be sent to the estate to perform this forestry and agricultural labour, and Lina, now the mistress of the property in full, assumed direct responsibility for overseeing their daily work. According to post-war testimony from survivors, Lina Heydrich did not merely delegate the supervision of these forced labourers to estate staff or SS guards. She personally involved herself in their treatment, and multiple witnesses later testified that she subjected prisoners to physical abuse, an allegation that would follow her for the rest of her life, even as German authorities repeatedly declined to prosecute it. The picture that emerges from these accounts is a chilling one. A woman whose mornings might begin with breakfast with her children and end in the afternoon, walking among prisoners, labouring in her orchards, meting out punishment for perceived slights or insufficient productivity. Whatever affection Reinhard Heydrich had shown toward his own children, and whatever charm Lina herself displayed in her interviews with sympathetic biographers decades later, the daily reality of life at Jungfernbrechen, under her direct management, included the systematic exploitation and mistreatment of people the Nazi state had, already marked for destruction. It is a detail that complicates and arguably shatters any attempt to view Lina Heydrich purely as an oblivious homemaker who simply raised her children while history happened elsewhere. The estate's labour force would later expand and change composition as the war ground on. By February of 1944, the site had been formally designated an official subcamp of the Flossenbürg concentration camp system, known as AL Jungfernbrechen, and the original Jewish forced labourers from Theresienstadt were replaced by a smaller contingent of 15 prisoners, drawn from Germany, the Netherlands, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, most of them Jehovah's Witnesses who had been imprisoned for refusing to swear loyalty oaths to the Nazi state or perform military service on religious grounds. These prisoners lived and worked under SS Guard, labouring in the same orchards and vegetable gardens that had occupied their predecessors, and while later accounts noted that food rations were often insufficient, the relatively agricultural nature of the work meant opportunities existed to supplement their diet informally, a small mercy amid otherwise grim conditions. All 15 of these later prisoners would, remarkably, survive to see liberation in May of 1945. A fate that stood in stark contrast to the earlier Jewish labourers from Theresienstadt, who were deported onward in February of 1944. Their ultimate fate's a grim and unstated footnote in the history of the estate. Amid all of this, Lina still had to run a household and raise 4 children largely on her own. Her routine blended the roles of estate manager, mother, and, in an unofficial but very real sense, camp overseer, 3 functions that most people would find impossible to reconcile within a single conscience, let alone a single day's schedule. She corresponded regularly with her own mother back on Fehmarn, kept up appearances within the small community of German occupation officials still stationed in the Protectorate, and continued to defend her late husband's reputation at every opportunity, a habit that would only intensify in the decades to come. Tragedy struck the family again on the 24th of October 1943, when her elder son Klaus, then 10 years old, was cycling with his younger brother Haider in the courtyard of the estate. Seeing that the driveway gates to the public road had been left open, Klaus rode his bicycle out onto the street, where he was struck by a passing truck. He died from his injuries later that same afternoon. Lina, consumed by grief and fury, demanded that the truck's driver and passengers be executed for their role in her son's death, but an official investigation ultimately acquitted them of any wrongdoing, finding the collision to be a tragic accident rather than a criminal act. Klaus was buried in the garden of the estate that had already claimed so much of the family's fortune and reputation, a private grief unfolding on the grounds of a property built on the forced labour of people the family itself had helped condemn. By the beginning of 1945, the fairy tale, if it could still be called that, was collapsing entirely. The Red Army was advancing rapidly westward through Czechoslovakia, and the German population of the Protectorate, including the thousands of officials, soldiers, and their families who had spent years living in relative comfort under occupation, now faced the very real prospect of Soviet vengeance. In April of 1945, Lina Heydrich packed up her remaining 3 children, Haida, Silke, and the toddler Marta, and joined the desperate exodus of Germans fleeing west ahead of the advancing Soviet forces. What did her days look like during this flight? Gone were the servants, the estate staff, and the forced labourers who had once carried out her instructions. In their place was the chaos of a collapsing front. Roads clogged with refugees and the constant fear of Soviet soldiers whose reputation for brutal reprisals against German civilians, and particularly against the families of high-ranking Nazi officials, was already well known. The family made their way first to Bavaria, part of the general westward tide of refugees seeking to place themselves in territory that would fall under American or British control rather than Soviet occupation. Eventually, Lina and her surviving children made their way back to the one place that had always represented safety and stability for her. The island of Fehmarn, where she had been born and raised. The family home there had been requisitioned by the British Army in the immediate aftermath of the German surrender, used as accommodation for occupying forces. But by the end of 1945, the British had moved out and Lina was permitted to reclaim the property. It was here, on the small windswept island of her childhood, that Lina Heydrich would rebuild her life over the following decades, transforming herself from the widow of one of the Third Reich's most notorious mass murderers into a defiant, occasionally charming, and thoroughly unrepentant fixture of post-war West German society. How did the Allied and German authorities handle a woman whose husband had been one of the chief architects of the Holocaust? The process of denazification established by the Allied occupying powers to identify and punish those complicit in Nazi crimes subjected Lina Heydrich to formal scrutiny in the years immediately following the war. Remarkably, she emerged from these proceedings cleared of wrongdoing. The German authorities of the emerging Federal Republic proved no more eager to pursue her than the Allied occupation courts had been. Despite the wartime testimony that would later surface regarding her mistreatment of forced labourers at Jungfernbrechen, Lina Heydrich never stood trial for those actions. The West German legal and political establishment, still grappling with the enormous task of reconstructing a functioning state out of the wreckage of the Third Reich, and often staffed by former Nazi party members and sympathisers who had simply switched allegiances after 1945, showed little appetite for prosecuting the widow of a dead war criminal for crimes that seemed, in the chaotic post-war reckoning, almost secondary to the towering scale of what her husband had done. She was officially cleared, and she was permitted to retake full possession of her financial assets and her house on Fehmarn. Freed from formal legal jeopardy, Lina turned her attention to a new project, securing a state pension as the widow of a fallen German official. This effort would consume a significant portion of her time and energy over the following decade, and would ultimately produce one of the most bitterly contested legal sagas of any Nazi widow's post-war life. Her argument rested on a technicality with enormous moral weight attached to it. Reinhard Heydrich had held the rank of a general in the German police force at the time of his death, and under West German law, widows of officials killed in the line of duty were entitled to state pensions, regardless of the political circumstances of their service. The West German government initially refused to pay, citing Heydrich's central role in orchestrating the Holocaust as sufficient grounds to deny his widow any benefit derived from his official rank. Lina, however, was not a woman inclined to accept refusal quietly. She pursued the matter through the West German courts, and in a pair of rulings handed down in 1956 and 1959, she won. The courts determined that Reinhard Heydrich's formal status as a police general killed in action while performing his official duties entitled his widow to a substantial pension, one roughly equivalent to that of a retired government minister, regardless of the moral character of the office he had held. The rulings caused considerable public controversy in West Germany, a country still working through the painful and incomplete process of confronting its Nazi past. Critics pointed out the grim irony of a state built explicitly on the rejection of Nazism, nonetheless being legally compelled to hand over a comfortable pension to the widow of one of the Holocaust's principal architects, funded by the taxes of a population that included Holocaust survivors and the families of Heydrich's victims. For Lina, though, the outcome was simply vindication, another data point in a lifelong narrative she was constructing in which she and her late husband were the true victims of history's judgment, rather than its perpetrators. With her pension secured, her days on Fehmarn settled into a pattern that combined the ordinary rhythms of small island life with an increasingly public role as the keeper of Reinhard Heydrich's memory and reputation. What did Lina actually do with her time on Fehmarn during these years? She managed her property, corresponded extensively with historians, journalists and researchers who were beginning to turn their attention to the Third Reich's senior leadership, and cultivated relationships within a network of former SS officers and sympathizers who treated her, and the memory of her husband, with continued reverence. Her home became something of an informal gathering point for this circle, and she eventually opened a small guest house and restaurant on the property, a business that catered, at least in part, to former SS men who travelled to the island to socialise, reminisce, and exchange stories of what they still, apparently without irony, referred to as the good old days. It was a strange and troubling second career for a woman who had once been the wife of the Reich's most feared security chief, innkeeper to an ageing and unrepentant network of former Nazis, serving meals and pouring drinks to men who had once served under or alongside her late husband's murderous apparatus. Lina's personal life took an unexpected turn in 1965. While on holiday in Finland, she met a Finnish theatre director named Mauno Manninen, the son of the well-known Finnish poet Otto Manninen and the writer Annie Swan. Manninen, who had founded a respected Helsinki theatre and built a career in the arts far removed from the world of Nazi Germany, had reportedly first become curious about Lina after reading an article about her and travelled to Fehmarn specifically to meet her. The two married later that year, though by Lina's own account and the assessment of those who studied the union, the marriage was one of practical convenience rather than romantic passion. It allowed her, at long last, to shed the surname Heydrich, a name that had followed her for over 3 decades and that carried by the 1960s an almost unbearable weight of infamy wherever she went. As Frau Manninen, she could move through certain aspects of public life with slightly less immediate recognition, even as she continued, privately and often publicly, to identify herself first and foremost as the widow of Reinhard Heydrich. Married life with Manninen brought a new chapter of activity to Lina's daily routine. Together, the couple took over full operation of the Heydrich family's former summer house on Fehmarn, converting it into a proper restaurant and inn known as the Imbria Parva. Lina's days now revolved around the demands of hospitality, preparing for guests, managing a small staff, overseeing the kitchen, and maintaining the property's grounds and guest rooms. The business became modestly successful, drawing not only ordinary tourists to the scenic island, but also, as before, a steady stream of former SS officers and Nazi sympathizers who sought out the establishment, specifically because of its connection to Heydrich's legacy. For several years, this innkeeping partnership defined Lina's public identity on Fehmarn. No longer simply a scandalous widow living in seclusion, but an active businesswoman running a going concern with her second husband. That chapter, however, came to an abrupt and destructive end in February of 1969, when welding work being carried out within the building's roof space accidentally ignited the structure's thatched roof. The resulting fire gutted the Imbria Parva, destroying the business that Lina and Mauno had built together. Later that same year, Mauno Manninen died, leaving Lina a widow for the second time in her life, now in her late 50s, with the physical embodiment of her second marriage reduced to ash and her professional life as an innkeeper effectively over. Long before any of this, of course, Lina had spent nearly 2 decades as a single mother raising 3 children on Fehmarn in the shadow of their father's infamy, and it is worth pausing to consider what those years actually looked like on a day-to-day basis. Heide, her surviving son, grew up on the island through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, eventually pursuing a career as an engineer and settling, later in life, in the Bavarian town of Wörthsee, where he would spend decades declining to discuss his father publicly at all, a silence that stood in stark and deliberate contrast to his mother's lifelong compulsion to defend Reinhard's memory at every opportunity. Silke, born in 1939, and Marte, born just weeks after her father's death in 1942, likewise grew up under Lina's roof on Fehmarn, attending local schools, absorbing the particular and peculiar burden of being the daughters of one of history's most notorious mass murderers in a country still trying to work out how to talk about its recent past. Marty would eventually settle into a quiet adult life on Fehmarn itself, at one point running a small fashion shop in the nearby town of Burg, a modest and unremarkable existence that offers almost no public record beyond the bare facts of her birth and her later residence, in sharp contrast to the mountain of documentation surrounding her mother. Lina's daily routine as a single parent in these years combined the practical demands of raising children on a fixed, initially uncertain income with her growing second career as a kind of unofficial custodian of her husband's historical reputation. She corresponded regularly with authors and researchers, some sympathetic and some deeply critical, who were beginning to piece together the full scope of Reinhard Heydrich's role in the Holocaust. She wrote letters to newspapers correcting what she regarded as inaccuracies in press coverage of her late husband, a habit she maintained for decades, and that reveals just how much of her time and mental energy remained devoted to managing his legacy, even as she raised 3 children largely alone. Visitors to Fehmarn during these years, particularly journalists and historians who sought her out for interviews, often remarked on the strange duality of her presentation: a friendly, hospitable, even charming hostess on the surface, offering tea and home-cooked meals in a cosy island cottage, who would then, often within the same conversation, offer chilling and matter-of-fact defences of her husband's role in state-organised mass murder. Perhaps the most extensive record of how Lina spent her later years and of how she thought about her past comes from her long relationship with the American writer Nancy Dougherty, who first began interviewing Lina in the 1970s for what would eventually become a sprawling dual biography of Reinhard and Lina Heydrich, though the finished manuscript would not see publication until decades after both women's deaths. Dougherty conducted 3 extended interview sessions with Lina at her home on Fehmarn, tape-recording hours of conversation about Reinhard's childhood, his rise through the SS, his relationships with Himmler and other senior Nazi figures, and, above all, Lina's own experience of their marriage. What emerges from these interviews is a portrait of a woman who spent an enormous amount of her post-war time and energy constructing, refining and defending a very particular narrative, that Reinhard Heydrich had been, in essence, a dutiful professional and a loving family man who happened to work in a field, security and policing, that placed him in proximity to terrible things he did not personally orchestrate or even fully understand. According to these interviews, Lina insisted repeatedly that she had never interfered with her husband's work and had never truly grasped its details, describing herself as someone who simply ran the household and raised the children, while Reinhard handled matters entirely outside her sphere of knowledge or interest. She offered vivid, humanizing anecdotes about Reinhard's private passions, his skill at riding, sailing, fencing, and tennis, his considerable musical talent on the violin, his close bond with his children, and his gossipy, affectionate correspondence with Lina's own mother about matters as mundane as the weather or the state of the garden on Fehmarn. She spoke with evident relish about how many people were frightened of her husband, remarking in one interview that even Heinrich Himmler himself was occasionally intimidated by Reinhard's forceful presence, a detail she seemed to offer with something close to pride. Yet when the conversation turned to the machinery of the Holocaust itself, to the Einsatzgruppen, killing squads Reinhard commanded, to the Wannsee Conference he chaired, to the deportations he ordered from the protectorate he governed, Lina's account shifted into a register of denial and deflection that startled even sympathetic interviewers. She insisted that the mass murder of Europe's Jews was, in her words, technically not at all possible on the scale historians described, and she characterized talk of atrocities committed in the camps under her husband's authority as nothing more than a kind of fairy tale, dismissing decades of documented historical research with the same casual confidence she brought to describing her husband's love of croquet. By the mid-1970s, Lina decided to commit her version of events to a permanent, published record. In 1976, she released her memoir titled Leben mit einem Kriegsverbrecher, or Life with a War Criminal, a title she selected with deliberate irony, intending it as a wry commentary on how history had come to judge her husband, rather than as any kind of confession or admission of guilt. She would later admit to regretting the title. Not because she had changed her assessment of Reinhard, but because so many readers took the phrase at face value rather than recognizing the sardonic distance she believed she had built into it. Writing the memoir occupied a considerable portion of her time during these years, requiring her to revisit decades of personal correspondence, photographs and memories, organizing them into a narrative that could stand as her definitive public statement on her marriage and her husband's legacy. The book offered readers an intimate domestic portrait, family holidays, private jokes, the texture of daily life inside one of the Third Reich's most infamous households, all presented with a warmth that most readers found deeply unsettling, given what they already knew about the man at the centre of the story. Years later, the memoir would be reissued under a new title, My Life with Reinhard, with an introduction contributed by her son Haida, a rare public gesture from a man who had otherwise spent his adult life avoiding any discussion of his father. Lina's role as the self-appointed guardian of Reinhard's reputation reached perhaps its most public flashpoint in 1978 and 1979. When West German television broadcast the American miniseries Holocaust, a dramatized account of the Nazi genocide that included a portrayal of Reinhard Heydrich, played by the English actor David Warner. The broadcast caused an enormous sensation across West Germany, credited by many historians with helping to shift German public consciousness toward a more direct reckoning with the crimes of the Nazi era than decades of official commemoration had managed to achieve. For Lina, watching a dramatized version of her late husband appear on national television was apparently intolerable. She gave interviews denouncing the production as irresponsible, arguing that it distorted the historical record, ignored what she considered the true horrors of the camps in favor of melodrama, and risked reopening old wounds while stoking a dangerous resurgence of latent anti-Semitism within German society. An argument that inverted the actual moral stakes of the broadcast in a way that many observers found breathtaking. She dismissed the on-screen depiction of her husband as unrecognizable, comparing it to a work of fiction entirely disconnected from the man she had known, and she reiterated on camera her now familiar claims of personal ignorance regarding the mechanics of the final solution, stating in one widely reported interview that she had not known the details and had not mingled with the officials responsible for such matters. In the same interview, she went further still, suggesting that the final solution itself had nothing to do with her husband at all, and offering the extraordinary claim that Europe's Jews had simply been shipped to the Urals rather than exterminated, a statement that placed her firmly among the small but persistent community of individuals willing to minimize or distort the historical record of the Holocaust even in the face of overwhelming documentary evidence, much of it generated by her own husband's organization. What are we to make of a woman who spent her final decades this way, dividing her time between the ordinary business of daily life on a small Baltic island and an increasingly public campaign of historical denial and reputation management on behalf of a man responsible for the deaths of untold thousands? Lina Heydrich's later interviews reveal someone who remained, by most accounts, sharp, articulate, and entirely unbowed by the weight of history's judgment. She continued granting interviews to historians and journalists well into old age, maintaining her network of correspondence and living out her days in the modest comfort her hard-won pension provided. She never expressed public remorse for her husband's actions, never acknowledged any personal complicity in the mistreatment of the forced labourers who had once worked her estate's orchards, and never wavered from the central narrative she had spent 3 decades constructing, that she and Reinhard had been, above all else, victims of circumstance and historical misunderstanding. Lina Heydrich's final years followed the quiet rhythms of small island life, punctuated occasionally by a visiting researcher or journalist eager to hear, one more time, her account of life with the architect of the final solution. She remained on Fehmarn, close to the site of both her childhood and the burned ruins of the inn she and Mauno had once run together, surrounded by the physical landmarks of a life that had traced an extraordinary arc from provincial schoolteacher's daughter to the wife of one of history's most notorious mass murderers, and back again to obscurity on a small Baltic island. She died in Fehmarn on the 14th of August 1985 at the age of 74, having outlived her first husband by more than 4 decades, having outlived her second husband by 16 years, and having spent nearly the entirety of that long widowhood defending, explaining, and mythologizing the 11 years she had spent married to Reinhard Heydrich. Her death drew renewed attention from historians and journalists, many of whom used the occasion to revisit her interviews and her memoir, weighing her testimony against the mountain of documentary evidence that had, by the 1980s, thoroughly established the scope and mechanics of her husband's crimes. What became of the grand Bohemian estate that had once been the stage for so much of Lina's wartime life? Jungfernbrechen, or Panenské Břežany, as it reverted to being known once again, was seized by the reconstituted Czechoslovak state at the end of the war, its status as a monument to Nazi occupation making it an obvious target for nationalization. Over the following decades, the property underwent a slow and undignified transformation, its once grand grounds gradually filled with workshops and industrial buildings as the Czechoslovak state repurposed the estate for practical use, and the chateau itself eventually came under the administration of a state metal research institute, before falling into extended disuse and disrepair. The elegant Art Deco staircase that had once welcomed the Reich protector home from his daily commute into Prague, and the orchards where forced labourers had once worked under Lina's supervision, became a minor and largely forgotten chapter in the broader landscape of post-war Czechoslovakia, the estate's glory days as the residence of the country's Nazi ruler, fading into a strange historical footnote, remembered chiefly by historians researching the Heydrich family and by the dwindling number of survivors who had once laboured on its grounds. The site's connection to the machinery of Nazi persecution did not end with the war's conclusion either. Decades after Lina and her children fled westward in 1945, historians and memorial researchers working to document the full extent of the concentration camp system's reach identified Jungfernbrechen's role as an official satellite camp of Flossenbürg, adding the estate to the broader historical record of the more than 1,000 subcamps that fed forced and slave labour into the German war economy during the war's final years. For the survivors of that subcamp, the Bible student prisoners who had laboured in Lina's orchards and vegetable gardens through the war's final desperate months, the estate remained a specific and personal chapter of their own imprisonment, one small node within an almost incomprehensibly vast system of exploitation that had claimed millions of lives across occupied Europe, a system that Lina Heydrich, for all her later protestations of ignorance and innocence, had once helped administer with her own hands on her own stolen property. Historians who have studied Lina Heydrich's life closely have arrived at sharply divergent assessments of how much credibility to extend to her own account of her daily existence and her level of knowledge about her husband's crimes. Robert Gerwarth, whose 2011 biography of Reinhard Heydrich, titled Hitler's Hangman, remains widely regarded as the standard scholarly work on the subject, drew on extensive archival research, including the tens of thousands of surviving files from the Reich Security Main Office housed in German federal archives, to construct a portrait of Reinhard Heydrich that leaves little room for the sympathetic, apolitical technocrat that Lina spent decades describing to journalists and biographers. Nancy Dougherty's posthumously published dual biography, by contrast, leaned heavily on her direct interviews with Lina herself, offering readers an intimate window into the domestic texture of the Heydrich marriage, but drawing criticism from other historians for accepting Lina's self-serving narrative with what many regarded as insufficient skepticism, and for failing to cross-reference Lina's recollections against the documentary record in the way Gerwarth and other archive-based historians had done. The tension between these two approaches, one grounded in files and orders, the other grounded in the memories of a woman with every incentive to shape those memories favourably, mirrors a broader challenge that runs through the entire history of the Third Reich's perpetrators and their families. How much weight should be given to the personal testimony of people who lived inside the machinery of genocide, but who, in the decades afterward, had every reason to minimise, deny, or simply forget their own proximity to its worst crimes? What emerges from this tension, when applied specifically to the question of what Lina Heydrich actually did all day, is a portrait considerably more damning than the one she herself spent a lifetime constructing. Yes, she managed a household, raised 4 children largely alone, corresponded with her mother about mundane matters, played croquet, rode horses, and hosted dinners, the ordinary texture of a wife and mother's daily existence that she emphasized so heavily in her interviews. But she also joined the Nazi Party 2 years before meeting her husband, actively steered him toward the SS when his naval career collapsed, benefited enormously from the plunder and privilege that came with his rise through the ranks of the Reich Security Main Office, occupied a mansion confiscated from a Jewish industrialist, and, when given direct authority over concentration camp prisoners on her own estate, allegedly subjected them to physical abuse, rather than the ordinary decency one might hope even the most politically indifferent household manager could extend to those in her charge. The mundane and the monstrous existed side by side in Lina Heydrich's daily schedule, often within the very same afternoon, a juxtaposition that historians continue to find one of the most disquieting aspects of her entire biography, precisely because it resists the comfortable moral clarity that later generations often want from the story of the Third Reich's perpetrators and their families. To understand just how extraordinary Lina Heydrich's claims of ignorance truly were, it helps to step back and consider exactly what her husband was doing during the years she insisted she knew nothing about. Reinhard Heydrich did not simply hold an abstract desk job somewhere within the vast bureaucracy of the Nazi state. As head of the Reich Security Main Office, he presided directly over the Gestapo, the Kripo, and the SD, giving him command of virtually every instrument of political terror and surveillance the regime possessed. Under his direct authority, the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units that followed the German army into Poland and later the Soviet Union, murdered well over 1 million people, most of them Jews, in mass shootings that left entire communities annihilated in the space of a single day. Heydrich did not simply issue distant orders for this campaign of murder. He toured the Eastern Front personally, reviewed operational reports detailing the exact numbers of people killed, region by region, and pressed his subordinates for ever greater efficiency in what the regime's internal paperwork euphemistically termed special treatment. On the 20th of January 1942, Heydrich chaired the Wannsee Conference at a lakeside villa in a wealthy Berlin suburb, gathering senior representatives from across the Nazi bureaucracy to coordinate what would become the industrialized murder of Europe's Jewish population. A meeting that lasted less than 2 hours, but that historians regard as one of the most consequential gatherings of the 20th century, precisely because of the cold, bureaucratic efficiency with which it addressed the logistics of genocide. Heydrich personally governed the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia with such calculated brutality, including the mass execution of Czech resistance figures and intellectuals, in a campaign that came to be known as the First Heydrichiade, that he earned nicknames from his own colleagues, including the Butcher of Prague and the Hangman, monikers that reflected genuine terror rather than mere propaganda. His assassination in May of 1942 triggered reprisals of such savagery, most notoriously the complete destruction of the village of Lidis, where every adult male was shot and the women and children deported. That the event remains to this day one of the most infamous examples of collective punishment carried out anywhere during the Second World War. This was the man whose household Lina Heydrich ran, whose children she raised, whose reports she watched him read every morning while being shaved, and whose 30-minute commute into Prague she was intimately familiar with, down to the exact curve in the road where his car was eventually ambushed. To claim, as she did repeatedly for the rest of her life, that she had no meaningful awareness of what her husband's daily work actually involved requires accepting an extraordinary degree of willful compartmentalization, one that many historians find simply implausible, given the sheer scale and visibility of what Heydrich was doing, the constant stream of visitors and colleagues who moved through their household, and Lina's own demonstrated intelligence, political engagement, and hands-on involvement in running the family's affairs. It is far more likely, based on the documentary record and the pattern of her own behaviour, that Lina Heydrich understood a great deal more than she ever admitted, and that her decades of insistence otherwise represented a calculated survival strategy rather than a genuine account of her own ignorance. How does Lina Heydrich compare to the other wives who occupied similar positions within the senior leadership of the Third Reich? The parallels and contrasts are instructive. Ilse Hess, wife of Hitler's deputy Rudolf Hess, spent the war years as the wife of a man who flew alone to Scotland in 1941 in a bizarre and unauthorised attempt to broker peace with Britain, and who then spent decades imprisoned, first by the British and later at Spandau Prison in Berlin, leaving Ilse to manage a household under circumstances entirely different from Lina's own experience of sudden, violent widowhood. Emmy Goering, wife of Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Goering, occupied a position of enormous social prominence as an unofficial First Lady of the Third Reich, presiding over state functions and cultivating a lavish lifestyle built on plundered wealth. Yet, unlike Lina, she never faced accusations of personally abusing forced labourers. Her post-war punishment limited to a year's incarceration and the loss of a portion of her considerable fortune. Margaret Himmler, wife of the SS chief who had personally arranged for Lina's own pension battles and who had once reprimanded her for behaving like a politicizing widow, lived out her post-war years under an assumed name, eventually convicted as a profiteer of the Nazi regime, and sentenced to a brief term of penal labour before disappearing into obscurity, a far quieter post-war trajectory than the one Lina chose to pursue. What sets Lina Heydrich apart from virtually every other wife in this circle is the sheer persistence and visibility of her post-war advocacy on her husband's behalf. Where other Nazi wives largely retreated into private life, changing their names, avoiding publicity, and hoping the passage of time would allow their connection to the regime's crimes to fade from public memory, Lina did the opposite. She pursued a very public legal battle for her pension that forced the West German courts to confront the moral implications of compensating a mass murderer's widow. She granted interview after interview to historians and journalists, positioning herself as an indispensable primary source on her husband's life and character, even as she used those same interviews to minimize and distort the historical record of his crimes. She published a memoir, ran a business that catered explicitly to nostalgic former SS men, and appeared on national television to denounce a dramatized account of the Holocaust that had, if anything, understated the scope of what her husband had actually done. In a landscape of Nazi widows who mostly chose silence and obscurity, Lina Heydrich chose visibility, confrontation, and an unrelenting defense of a man whose name had become synonymous with some of the 20th century's worst atrocities. What became of Lina's surviving children as they grew into adulthood, carrying the weight of the Heydrich name into the post-war decades? Heide Heydrich, born in December of 1934, grew up largely on Fehmarn under his mother's care, eventually training as an engineer and settling into a quiet professional life far from the public attention his mother continued to court. He maintained what appears to have been a policy of near total public silence regarding his father, declining interviews and public comment for decades, a stark contrast to his mother's compulsive engagement with journalists and historians. His one notable public gesture came late in life when he allowed his name to be attached to the reissued edition of his mother's memoir, contributing an introduction that suggested at least some continued sympathy with the family narrative Lina had spent her life constructing, even if he otherwise kept his own views largely private. Silke Heydrich, born in April of 1939, similarly maintained a low public profile throughout her adult life, and the historical record contains relatively little detail about her later years beyond confirmation that she, like her siblings, grew up on Fehmarn under her mother's care following the family's wartime flight from Czechoslovakia. Marthe Heydrich, the daughter born just 6 weeks after her father's death in July of 1942, grew up as perhaps the most poignant figure among the Heydrich children, a child who never knew her father at all, except through the mythology her mother constructed around his memory, and who reportedly bore a striking physical resemblance to him, despite never having met him. She remained on Fehmarn into adulthood, at one point operating a small fashion shop in the nearby town of Berg, living a life so quiet and undocumented that historians researching the Heydrich family have found remarkably little public information about her adult experiences, her personal views on her father's legacy, or how she reconciled growing up as the youngest child of one of history's most notorious mass murderers with whatever ordinary life she managed to build for herself on the small island where the entire Heydrich saga had, in a sense, both begun and ended. Where Lina spent her life aggressively shaping public perception of the family's history, her children, by contrast, appear to have collectively chosen the opposite path, retreating into private lives conducted almost entirely outside the historical record. A silence that speaks its own kind of testimony about the burden of carrying the Heydrich name into the second half of the 20th century. It is worth returning in greater detail to the whirlwind courtship that first brought Lina into Reinhard Heydrich's orbit, since the scandal it produced reveals a great deal about both of their characters and about the kind of partnership they would build together. When the two met at that rowing club ball in Kiel in December of 1930, Heydrich was, by the account of his own colleagues, a man of what one contemporary described as an ungovernable sexual appetite, someone who surrendered himself to romantic and physical impulses without the calculated control that otherwise characterized every other aspect of his behavior. He had, in the months before meeting Lina, been informally understood to be courting another woman, the daughter of a prosperous shipbuilder with close personal ties to Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, the commander-in-chief of the German Navy. According to several accounts, Heydrich had spent a night with this woman in a hotel under circumstances that she and her family understood to constitute an implicit promise of marriage. When Heydrich instead proposed to Lina just 3 days after meeting her, and the engagement became public knowledge on the 18th of December 1930, the spurned woman came forward with her account, and her father, furious at the perceived insult to his daughter's honour, took the matter directly to Raeder himself. The resulting Naval Court of Honour convened in the spring of 1931 to examine whether Heydrich's conduct had violated the strict moral code expected of a German naval officer. Heydrich defended himself before the court with what observers described as a confidence that bordered on outright arrogance, refusing to concede any wrongdoing and insisting the entire matter had been blown wildly out of proportion. The court disagreed, finding him guilty of conduct inappropriate for an officer, and Admiral Raeder personally signed off on his dismissal in April of 1931, a decision that came, with particular cruelty, just weeks before Heydrich would have qualified for a naval pension after his years of service. Heydrich would later claim, in conversations with Lina and others, that his dismissal had actually stemmed from political grounds, rather than the official moral pretext, though most historians regard this as a face-saving rationalization, rather than an accurate account of what had actually happened. Whatever the underlying truth, the scandal left the 26-year-old Heydrich without a career at the very height of the Great Depression, precisely the crisis that Lina would help resolve by pointing him toward the SS. It is a strange historical irony that the entire machinery of the Holocaust, orchestrated years later by Reinhard Heydrich from behind a desk in Berlin, traces its origins in part to a broken engagement, a jealous rival, and a moralistic admiral who refused to look the other way, and to the resourcefulness of a 19-year-old fiancée who refused to let a career setback become a permanent one. What kind of woman was Lina Heydrich in the assessment of those who actually knew her? Contemporary accounts consistently describe her as sharp-tongued, strong-willed, and entirely unafraid to voice her opinions, traits that stood out within the deferential social culture expected of senior Nazi officials' wives. She was, by most descriptions, physically striking as a young woman, blonde and athletic, the product of her childhood spent rowing and swimming along Fehmarn's coastline, and she carried herself with a confidence that some found charming and others found abrasive. Within the tightly wound social circles of Berlin's SS elite, Lina cultivated a reputation for candour that occasionally bordered on indiscretion, offering blunt opinions about colleagues, rivals and superiors that a more cautious wife might have kept to herself. Her open dislike of Himmler's wife Margaret became something of an open secret within their circle, a rivalry that reflected broader tensions between the Heydrich and Himmler households, even as the two men remained professionally close and mutually dependent collaborators atop the SS security apparatus. Within the gossipy, status-conscious world of senior SS wives, women in Lina's social tier were sometimes referred to informally, and not always kindly, by nicknames reflecting their glamour, their ambition, or their perceived vanity. A culture of private mockery that existed just beneath the surface of the public deference these women were officially expected to receive as the spouses of the regime's most powerful men. Lina, by most accounts, gave as good as she got in this environment, trading barbed commentary and social judgments with the same confidence and bluntness that characterized every other aspect of her personality, never content to simply occupy the passive, ornamental role that Nazi ideology nominally assigned to German wives and mothers. This same bluntness would define her decades of post-war interviews, during which she rarely hedged her opinions or softened her defense of her husband, even when doing so might have served her better in the court of public opinion. What was Lina Heydrich actually doing on the day her husband was attacked? The available record suggests she was at Jungfernbrechen that morning, heavily pregnant with their fourth child, managing the household and children as she did every day while Reinhard made his customary commute into Prague. News of the ambush reached the estate sometime after the attack, and Lina rushed to be with her husband as he lay wounded in a Prague hospital. For several days, as doctors monitored his condition and cautiously suggested he might recover, Lina maintained a vigil at his bedside, caught between the demands of managing a household full of young children back at the estate and the desperate hope that Reinhard might survive his wounds. When sepsis set in and his condition deteriorated rapidly, she was reportedly present as his condition worsened toward the end. Watching the man she had helped launch into a career of unprecedented power and horror succumb to an infection born of shrapnel, cloth, and horsehair driven into his body by a homemade grenade. The state funeral that followed consumed the Nazi propaganda apparatus for days. Hitler personally travelled to Prague to view Heydrich's body lying in state at Prague Castle, and the coffin was then transported to Berlin for an elaborate ceremony at the Reich Chancellery, where Hitler himself delivered a eulogy, praising Heydrich as one of the finest servants the National Socialist idea had ever produced, and posthumously awarded him the Order of the German Eagle in gold, alongside other high honours. Himmler too spoke at the ceremony, delivering his own tribute to a man he had personally recruited over a decade earlier on the strength of a single impressive interview. Lina stood through these proceedings as the grieving widow the regime needed her to be, a role that required her to project public composure while privately absorbing the shock of her husband's death and preparing, unknowingly, for the birth of their fourth child, just weeks later. Behind the scenes, the assassination triggered a campaign of retribution far beyond anything the Czech resistance could have anticipated. Hitler ordered the SS to identify and destroy the village of Lidice, wrongly suspected of harbouring connections to the assassins, and in the days that followed, German forces executed every adult male in the village, deported the women to concentration camps and the children to a mix of German re-education homes and, in many tragic cases, extermination, and then burned the village itself to the ground and levelled its ruins, erasing Lidice from the map entirely as a calculated act of collective terror intended to warn the rest of occupied Europe against any further acts of resistance. The specific allegations regarding Lina's treatment of the forced labourers at Jungfernbrechen deserve closer examination, since they represent perhaps the single most damning piece of evidence against the sympathetic, apolitical portrait she spent decades constructing of herself. Multiple survivor testimonies gathered after the war described Lina Heydrich personally involving herself in the punishment and mistreatment of prisoners assigned to work her estate's orchards and gardens. Some accounts describe her physically striking labourers she believed were working insufficiently hard, while others describe more degrading treatment intended to humiliate prisoners already stripped of virtually every basic dignity by the concentration camp system that had delivered them to her estate in the first place. Historians examining these accounts have noted a grim consistency in their broad outlines, even where specific details vary between different witnesses, lending credibility to the overall picture of a woman who exercised direct, personal, and often cruel authority over the people forced to labour on her property, rather than remaining the detached, uninvolved household manager she later claimed to have been. That German authorities never brought formal charges against her for this conduct reflects less on the credibility of the survivor testimony than on the broader failures of West Germany's early post-war justice system, which prosecuted only a small fraction of the individuals credibly implicated in Nazi-era crimes, particularly when those individuals were women, and particularly when their crimes fell outside the relatively narrow categories that occupying Allied courts and early West German prosecutors chose to prioritize. The mechanics of Lina's pension battle deserve a closer look as well, since the legal reasoning behind her eventual victory illuminates just how thoroughly the young Federal Republic struggled to draw clean lines between honouring its bureaucratic and legal obligations and confronting the moral rot at the heart of the Nazi state's institutions. West German pension law, largely inherited from earlier German legal traditions, provided automatic benefits to the widows of civil servants and police officials killed in the line of duty, without any built-in mechanism for disqualifying beneficiaries based on the moral character of the deceased's actual conduct in that role. When Lina first applied for her widow's pension in the years immediately following the war, officials initially balked, informally if not always formally citing Heydrich's central role in the Holocaust as sufficient grounds for refusal, even though no specific statutory provision actually authorized denying benefits on those grounds. Lina, represented by lawyers who recognized the strength of her narrow legal position, even if her husband's moral position was indefensible, pressed the matter through the courts. The 1956 ruling established the basic principle that her claim was legally valid under existing pension statutes, and the 1959 decision, following further government resistance and appeal, confirmed and finalized her right to collect the full benefit, calculated according to Heydrich's final rank and salary, as though he had been an entirely ordinary official who happened to die while serving his country. The case became something of a landmark, cited by legal scholars and historians alike as an illustration of the profound structural difficulties West Germany faced in reconciling its new democratic rule of law identity with the countless individuals, both victims and perpetrators, whose lives remained entangled with the legal and administrative apparatus of the Nazi state. Other Nazi-era widows and former officials would cite the Heydrich pension precedent in their own subsequent legal battles for benefits, and the controversy it generated fed into broader public debates during the late 1950s and 1960s about the adequacy of West Germany's efforts to confront its Nazi past. Debates that would eventually contribute to a more assertive, if still incomplete, era of prosecutions and public reckoning in the years that followed, including the landmark Frankfurt-Auschwitz trials of the mid-1960s, held only a few years after Lina had secured her own pension victory. Lina Heydrich's story also fits within a broader and increasingly well-documented pattern of female complicity within the Nazi system, one that historians have worked in recent decades to bring into fuller focus after decades in which the story of the Third Reich was told almost exclusively through the actions of its male perpetrators. Scholars researching women's roles in the machinery of Nazi Germany have documented thousands of cases of German women who served as camp guards, administrative staff processing deportation orders, nurses involved in euthanasia programs, and wives who, like Lina, benefited materially and socially from their husbands' positions within the apparatus of persecution, while maintaining, publicly, and sometimes even to themselves, a fiction of domestic innocence entirely separate from the political violence surrounding them. Lina's case stands out within this broader pattern, not because her complicity was unique, but because the scale of documentation surrounding her life, thanks to her own eagerness to grant interviews and publish a memoir, makes her an unusually well-illuminated example of exactly how that fiction of domestic innocence could be constructed and maintained across 4 decades. Even in the face of substantial evidence to the contrary, there is, ultimately, no way to fully separate the mundane from the monstrous when reconstructing what Lina Heydrich actually did all day across the many decades of her long life. She was, unquestionably, a mother who raised 4 children, 2 of them largely alone after her husband's assassination, and a woman who endured her own share of genuine tragedy, including the sudden and devastating death of her 10-year-old son in a road accident just outside the walls of her own estate. She was also, unquestionably, a woman who joined the Nazi Party before she ever met the man who would make her name infamous, who nudged that man toward a career in the SS at the precise moment when a different nudge might have sent history in an entirely different direction, who lived for years in a mansion confiscated from a Jewish industrialist, who accepted an even grander estate as a personal gift from Adolf Hitler in gratitude for her husband's role in organizing genocide, and who, when given direct personal authority over people the regime had already marked for destruction, allegedly treated them with a cruelty that echoed on a smaller and more intimate scale the cruelty her husband inflicted at the level of continents and populations. Her decades of interviews, her memoir, and her public denunciations of anyone who dared portray her husband honestly, all of it constitutes less an account of innocent domesticity than a masterclass in the construction of denial, sustained not for a few years in the immediate aftermath of catastrophe, but for the better part of half a century, right up until her final breath on the island where the entire story had begun. What ultimately became of the original group of Jewish forced labourers who worked Lina's estate before their replacement by the Bible student prisoners in February of 1944? The historical record here grows unfortunately thin, though the broader context of Theresienstadt's function within the Nazi camp system offers a grim and probable answer. Theresienstadt served the regime primarily as a transit point, a ghetto from which prisoners were regularly selected for deportation further east to extermination facilities, including Auschwitz-Birkenau, particularly as the pace of deportations accelerated through 1943 and into 1944. While the specific fates of the roughly 30 individuals who once tended Lina Heydrich's orchards and gardens are not comprehensively documented in the sources available today, the timing and pattern of their removal from the estate in February of 1944 aligns closely with a period of intensified deportations from Theresienstadt, and historians researching the broader network of Flossenbürg subcamps have generally treated the survival of this particular group of Jewish labourers as unlikely given what is known about the fate of the ghetto's population during this stage of the war. It stands in stark and telling contrast to the 15 Jehovah's Witness prisoners who replaced them and who, as the historical record confirms with far greater certainty, survived to see liberation in May of 1945. A difference in outcome that reflects nothing about the character or conduct of either group of prisoners and everything about the specific, murderous priority the Nazi regime assigned to the extermination of European Jewry above all other categories of persecution. One especially striking lesser-known thread runs through the story of the Lower Castle at Panenské Břežany, connecting Lina Heydrich's wartime household to one of the most famous art restitution sagas of the modern era. The estate's original owner, Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer, was not merely a wealthy sugar industrialist but also a major art collector whose family had commissioned and owned some of the most celebrated paintings by the Austrian artist Gustav Klimt, including a portrait of his own wife, Adele Bloch-Bauer, that would later become world famous under the title Woman in Gold, following a decades-long legal battle for its return to the family after the war. When the Nazis seized Bloch-Bauer's properties following the German occupation of Czechoslovakia, his art collection was scattered and looted alongside his real estate, and while Lina Heydrich herself was not the one who orchestrated that specific seizure, she and her family lived for years within the confiscated walls of a home whose rightful owner had been stripped of both his property and his life's work by the very regime her husband served. The Bloch-Bauer restitution case would not reach its famous resolution until the early 21st century, decades after Lina's own death, when Maria Altmann, a niece of Adele Bloch-Bauer, successfully sued the Austrian government for the return of the Klimt paintings, a legal battle later dramatized in a major film. It is a strange and fitting historical footnote that the woman who once described her stolen Bohemian estate as feeling like a fairy tale land where she felt like a princess was, quite literally, living inside the plundered legacy of a family whose own fairy tale had been violently and permanently interrupted by the same system of persecution that made her own privileged life possible. The Wannsee Conference itself, which Heydrich chaired in January of 1942 and which Lina always insisted she knew nothing about, brought together 15 senior officials representing a remarkable cross-section of the Nazi state's bureaucracy, including representatives from the Foreign Office, the Justice Ministry, the Interior Ministry, and various branches of the SS and police apparatus, underscoring just how deeply the planning of genocide had become embedded within the ordinary machinery of German government, rather than remaining confined to some isolated fringe of fanatics. Adolf Eichmann, who would later stand trial in Jerusalem in 1961 for his role in organizing the logistics of deportation, served as the meeting's secretary, taking minutes that would later become one of the most damning documents in the entire historical record of the Holocaust. Heydrich's own role at the meeting was to assert clear authority over the coordination of the coming genocide across all of occupied Europe, ensuring that rival agencies within the sprawling Nazi bureaucracy understood that his Reich Security Main Office would direct the practical implementation of what the assembled officials euphemistically termed the final solution of the Jewish question. It was this same man, fresh from establishing his supremacy over the machinery of continental genocide, who Lina insisted came home each evening simply to relax with a game of croquet and a glass of wine, entirely unburdened, in her telling, by the magnitude of what he had spent his day organizing. The reprisals following Heydrich's assassination extended well beyond the well-known destruction of Lidice. A second Czech village, Ležáky, suffered an almost identical fate just weeks later in June of 1942, after German investigators discovered evidence that a radio transmitter used by the paratroopers involved in the assassination plot had been hidden nearby. As with Lidice, every adult in Ležáky was executed, the children were taken away with only a small number ever returned to their families after the war, and the village itself was burned to the ground. Beyond these two infamous mass reprisals, the broader wave of retribution launched throughout the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia in the weeks following the assassination claimed several thousand additional lives through executions, mass arrests, and the dismantling of what remained of organised Czech resistance networks. This entire campaign of retaliatory terror, launched in the name of avenging Reinhard Heydrich, unfolded while Lina, heavily pregnant, awaited news of her husband's condition, and then, after his death, prepared to give birth to their fourth child amid a landscape of German-orchestrated devastation carried out explicitly in her husband's honour. Reinhard Heydrich's cultural afterlife has proven remarkably durable, a fact that Lina, during her own lifetime, both encouraged through her advocacy and resented whenever the portrayals strayed from her preferred narrative. Beyond the 1978 television miniseries that so incensed her, Heydrich has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries and dramatic films in the decades since her death, including cinematic treatments of the assassination plot itself and biographical works examining his rise through the Nazi security apparatus. The French author Laurent Binet's acclaimed 2010 book HHHH, later adapted into a feature film, revisited the story of Operation Anthropoid and the assassination for a new generation of readers, cementing Heydrich's continued position within popular historical memory as one of the regime's most chilling and consequential figures, a status that would likely have troubled Lina considerably had she lived to see the full scope of it, given her lifelong insistence that her husband's reputation had been unfairly distorted by dramatists and propagandists who, in her view, understood nothing of the man she claimed to have actually known. It is worth considering, too, how Lina Heydrich's own account of her daily life shifted and hardened over the decades as she granted successive rounds of interviews to different researchers with different levels of scrutiny and skepticism. Early post-war accounts, given closer to the events themselves, tended to emphasize practical matters: her efforts to secure her pension, the logistics of raising her children, the disposition of family property. By the time she sat for Nancy Doherty's extended interviews in the 1970s and 1980s, her narrative had crystallized into something closer to a fully formed apologia, complete with vivid, humanizing anecdotes designed to counter the public's association of her husband with pure, faceless evil. This evolution suggests a woman who spent decades refining her own defense, testing which stories resonated with sympathetic listeners and which drew skepticism, gradually perfecting a narrative of domestic innocence through repeated telling, rather than through any genuine reassessment of her own culpability. Historians who have compared her various interviews across the decades have noted this gradual smoothing and hardening of her account, describing it as a textbook example of how personal memory, particularly self-serving memory, can become more confident and more detailed with each retelling, even as its reliability as historical evidence correspondingly diminishes. The broader question of how post-war West Germany handled figures like Lina Heydrich also connects to a longer and still unresolved national reckoning that would continue for decades after her own death in 1985. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of the mid-1960s, the ongoing extradition battles over aging former camp guards and functionaries well into the 21st century, and periodic controversies over pensions paid to former SS members and their families all echo, in different forms, the same fundamental tension exposed by Lina's own successful pension litigation. A legal and bureaucratic system built to honour formal categories of service and rank, struggling repeatedly to account for the moral catastrophe those categories had sometimes been used to enable. Germany would continue grappling with these questions of accountability, restitution, and memory for the remainder of the 20th century and well into the 21st, and Lina Heydrich's decades-long campaign to rehabilitate her husband's reputation, however unsuccessful in the eyes of professional historians, remains a case study frequently cited in discussions of how post-war societies negotiate the uncomfortable space between legal technicality and moral accountability. Among the more sensational, if less central, chapters of Reinhard Heydrich's career was his establishment of what became known as Salon Kitty, an elegant Berlin brothel located on Giesebrechtstrasse near the fashionable Kurfürstendamm district, which the SD secretly acquired and wired for covert audio surveillance in order to eavesdrop on the pillow talk of the diplomats, generals and party officials who frequented it. The operation, run under Heydrich's authority as part of his broader intelligence apparatus, exemplified the kind of ruthless ends, justify the means thinking that defined his approach to state security, treating even the most intimate human interactions as raw material for intelligence gathering. Whether or how much Lina knew about this particular operation remains unclear from the historical record, though it fits within the broader pattern of an intelligence and security empire that touched nearly every corner of Berlin's political and social life during the years she was raising her children and managing the Heydrich household just a short distance away. It stands as one of many lesser-known details about her husband's actual working life that complicate her repeated claims of having existed largely outside his professional sphere, since the scope and audacity of operations like Salon Kitty were, by the later stages of the war, common knowledge within the small, gossip-prone social circles of Berlin's Nazi elite that Lina herself moved through regularly. Adolf Eichmann's own post-war fate offers an instructive point of comparison to Lina's, illustrating just how differently history judged those who worked directly under Heydrich's command, versus those like Lina, who occupied an adjacent but formerly private sphere. Eichmann, who had taken the minutes at the Wannsee Conference and who spent the following years organizing the logistics of deportation trains that carried millions of Jews to their deaths, fled to Argentina after the war using a false identity, living for over a decade in hiding before Israeli intelligence agents captured him near Buenos Aires in 1960 and smuggled him to Israel to stand trial. His 1961 trial in Jerusalem became a global media event, forcing a worldwide reckoning with the specific bureaucratic mechanisms of the Holocaust and introducing the phrase banality of evil into common usage following philosopher Hannah Arendt's controversial coverage of the proceedings. Eichmann was convicted and executed in 1962, one of the very few Holocaust perpetrators to face capital punishment for his crimes. Lina Heydrich, by contrast, never faced any equivalent reckoning, despite living openly under her own name in West Germany for the entire period during which Eichmann was being hunted, tried, and executed, a contrast that underscores just how differently the post-war world treated formally documented operational perpetrators compared to spouses and beneficiaries whose complicity, however substantial, remained harder to prosecute within existing legal frameworks. It is worth pausing to consider the counterfactual questions that Lina Heydrich's own actions inevitably raise. What might have happened had she not ignored Himmler's cancelled appointment and packed her fiancé's suitcase for that fateful trip to Munich in the summer of 1931? Had Reinhard Heydrich never made that connection, never impressed Himmler with his improvised vision for an SS intelligence service, he might have drifted into obscurity as a disgraced former naval officer, one of countless unemployed young men scraping by during the worst years of the Depression, his name never becoming synonymous with the organizational machinery of the Holocaust. Lina, in her own later interviews, seemed to take a certain pride in her role in launching her husband's career, never once suggesting any regret for having pushed him toward the SS. Even decades after the full scope of what that career would eventually produce had become common historical knowledge. This absence of any expressed regret over her own foundational role in her husband's rise stands as perhaps the single most revealing detail of her entire post-war testimony, more damning in some ways than her direct denials of Holocaust facts, because it demonstrates that even with the complete benefit of hindsight and full knowledge of everything her husband's career would come to represent, she never once suggested that she wished she had done anything differently. The reception of Lina's own memoir among contemporary reviewers in 1976 was notably mixed, with some critics praising its unusual intimacy as a historical document, while others expressed dismay at its evident evasions and its determinedly rosy portrait of a man responsible for organizing mass murder. Reviewers noted the peculiar effect of reading detailed, affectionate passages about Reinhard's musical talent, his athletic pursuits, and his devotion to their children, juxtaposed against the reader's own external knowledge of what the same man had been doing during his working hours. An effect that several critics described as deeply, deliberately disorienting, whether or not Lina intended it that way. The book found a readership primarily among those already sympathetic to a revisionist view of the Third Reich's senior leadership, as well as among historians who recognized its value as a primary source revealing the psychology of denial, even if they rejected its central claims, a strange dual legacy for a book. Its own author intended as vindication, rather than as inadvertent evidence of the very mechanisms of self-deception that allowed so many participants in and beneficiaries of Nazi rule to live out their remaining decades without ever fully confronting what they had been part of. One persistent rumour that shadowed Reinhard Heydrich throughout his career, and that Lina spent considerable energy denying in her later interviews, concerned unfounded but widely circulated claims within Nazi circles that he might have had distant Jewish ancestry on his father's side, stemming from confusion over his grandmother's second husband's surname. Historians have generally concluded that no credible evidence supports the claim, but the rumour followed Heydrich for much of his career, reportedly fueling insecurities that some biographers believe pushed him toward ever more extreme demonstrations of ideological zealotry as a way of proving his racial and political reliability beyond any possible doubt. Lina, when asked about the rumour in later interviews, dismissed it entirely, framing it as nothing more than the malicious gossip of political rivals within the SS, who resented her husband's rapid rise, and she used the episode as further evidence, in her own telling, of how unfairly Reinhard had been treated by colleagues and historians alike. Whether or not the rumour carried any truth, its persistence throughout Heydrich's lifetime, and Lina's own energetic engagement with refuting it decades after his death, illustrates just how much of her daily correspondence and conversation, even well into old age, remained devoted to managing the smallest details of her husband's reputation, no rumour too minor or too old to escape her attention and rebuttal. The death of Klaus, and Lina's furious demand that the driver responsible for the accident face execution, deserves a somewhat closer examination as well, since it offers one of the clearest available windows into her character under conditions of genuine, uncomplicated personal grief, rather than the calculated public performance that characterized so much of her later life. That her immediate instinct, upon losing her 10-year-old son, was to demand the death of the man involved, despite an official investigation that found the collision to be an accident rather than an act of negligence or malice, speaks to a personality accustomed to wielding, or at least invoking, the machinery of state violence to address personal loss. An instinct presumably shaped by years spent within a household where her husband held the power of life and death over enormous numbers of people as a matter of ordinary daily business, that the investigation ultimately declined to grant her wish, sparing the driver and his passengers despite the family's enormous political influence at the time, stands as one of the rare instances in this entire story where the machinery of the Nazi state, even in service of the grieving widow of its most feared security chief, stopped short of carrying out an execution on demand. Klaus's grave in the estate's garden would remain behind when the family fled westward in 1945, a small, permanent marker of loss left behind on the grounds of a property that would soon pass entirely out of the family's hands and into the custody of a Czechoslovak state determined to erase every trace of its Nazi occupiers. The broader pattern of Lina's engagement with grief, loss, and violence throughout her life reveals a consistent thread, an inability or an unwillingness to process any of these experiences through anything other than the lens of her own family's victimhood. She grieved her husband's assassination as an act of political murder committed against an innocent public servant, rather than as one predictable consequence of the campaign of terror he had waged against the Czech population for the better part of a year. She grieved her son's death as a senseless accident, demanding retribution rather than as one more instance of ordinary human tragedy unfolding, with grim irony, on an estate built on the forced suffering of others. and she grieved, in her own way, the destruction of her reputation and her husband's legacy across 4 decades of interviews and public statements, treating the historical judgment of the Holocaust's perpetrators as a kind of injustice visited upon her family, rather than as the world's overdue reckoning with crimes of almost unimaginable scale. This consistent inversion, positioning herself and her family as the wrong party in a story defined at every turn by the suffering her husband's career inflicted on millions of others, may be the single most revealing thread running through the entire 90-year arc of Lina Heydrich's remarkable and deeply troubling life. Beyond her informal social rivalries with women like Margaret Himmler, Lina also existed within the more formal structures the Nazi state built specifically to organize and mobilize German women, chief among them the National Socialist Women's League, or NS-Frauenschaft, headed throughout the Reich by Reichsfrauenführerin Gertrude Scholz-Klink. This organization promoted an official ideology of German womanhood built around motherhood, domesticity, and unwavering support for husbands serving the party and state, values that Lina, at least on the surface, embodied almost perfectly in her public role as the devoted wife of a rising SS official. Yet the organization's rhetoric of humble domestic service sat awkwardly alongside the lived reality of women like Lina, who enjoyed a standard of living and a degree of personal privilege entirely disconnected from the sacrifices demanded of ordinary German women during the same years, particularly after 1939, when wartime shortages and rationing began to reshape daily life for civilians across the Reich. While millions of German women stood in long lines for rationed bread, meat, and clothing, coped with the conscription of husbands and sons into a war that would eventually kill millions and increasingly absorb the physical dangers of Allied bombing campaigns targeting German cities, Lina Heydrich's household continued to enjoy the fruits of confiscated Jewish property, extensive domestic staff, and eventually an entire workforce of unpaid concentration camp labor tending her gardens and orchards. This gulf between official Nazi rhetoric, celebrating the sacrifices of ordinary German mothers, and the actual lived privilege of women like Lina Heydrich illustrates one of the regime's more persistent internal contradictions, one that grew more glaring as the war dragged on and conditions for the general population deteriorated sharply while the senior leadership and their families continued to enjoy relatively lavish standards of living behind the walls of their confiscated estates. Wartime visitors to Jungfernbrechen later described a household stocked with fine furnishings, art, and provisions that would have seemed almost unimaginable to an ordinary German family enduring the privations of the war's later years. A level of material comfort made possible by Reinhard's rank, by the plundered wealth flowing through the machinery of occupation, and, increasingly, by the unpaid labor Lina herself directed on the estate's grounds. It is a detail worth dwelling on precisely because it undercuts the image Lina spent decades cultivating of herself as an ordinary housewife, simply doing her best to raise a family amid difficult circumstances, when in reality her family occupied one of the most privileged and materially comfortable positions available to any German household during the entirety of the Second World War. The estate itself, beyond its role as a labor camp and family residence, also functioned as something of a showcase property, hosting visiting dignitaries and officials from Berlin who travelled to Prague to confer with Reinhard on matters of occupation policy. Lina, in her role as hostess, oversaw the practical details of entertaining these visitors, coordinating meals, accommodations, and the general presentation of the household to reflect favourably on her husband's status within the regime's hierarchy. This hosting role placed her in direct, repeated contact with many of the same senior SS and police officials who were simultaneously coordinating the machinery of occupation and genocide across the Protectorate and beyond, further complicating any claim that she existed in some kind of hermetically sealed domestic bubble, insulated from awareness of what her husband's colleagues were actually doing in their professional capacities. Guests at Jungfernbrechen during this period would have included men directly responsible for coordinating deportations, suppressing resistance, and administering the machinery of terror across occupied Czechoslovakia, all of them received, at least on occasion, in Lina's own dining room, seated at her own table, discussing matters of state in the presence of a hostess, who later insisted she had understood nothing of what her husband and his colleagues actually did. What did an ordinary evening at Jungfernbrechen look like during these years when Reinhard was home and not entertaining official guests? By Lina's own fond description, offered decades later to sympathetic interviewers, such evenings involved quiet, almost bourgeois domesticity. Reinhard playing with the children before bedtime, occasional musical performances, drawing on his considerable skill with the violin, correspondence with Lina's mother about matters entirely unrelated to politics, and the general rhythms of upper-class German family life transplanted into a stolen Bohemian mansion. It is this vision of domestic normalcy, repeated so consistently across so many decades of interviews, that historians have found most difficult to reconcile with the documented scope of Reinhard Heydrich's professional activities during these same years. And it is precisely this tension between the banal comforts of a happy family evening and the machinery of genocide being coordinated by the man enjoying that evening that continues to make Lina Heydrich's story such a uniquely unsettling case study within the broader history of the Third Reich's perpetrators and their households. It is worth briefly considering how Lina's choices compare to those of Magda Goebbels, wife of the Reich's propaganda minister, whose own story represents perhaps the starkest possible counterpoint among the senior Nazi wives of the era. As the Battle of Berlin closed in during the final days of April 1945, Magda Goebbels made the decision to remain in Hitler's underground bunker alongside her husband, and in the regime's final hours she poisoned her own 6 children before she and Joseph Goebbels took their own lives, an act of murder and suicide that has come to stand as one of the most chilling final chapters of the entire Nazi collapse. Lina Heydrich, by grim contrast, faced her own version of this reckoning nearly 3 years earlier and under very different circumstances. Her husband already dead by assassination rather than by his own hand, and she chose instead to flee westward with her surviving children, prioritizing their survival above any impulse toward a shared, ideological martyrdom. Whatever else can be said about Lina's subsequent decades of denial and self-justification, she did not choose the path of Magda Goebbels, and her children, unlike the Goebbels children, were permitted to grow into adulthood, however burdened by the weight of their family name. This distinction matters not because it redeems anything about Lina's own documented conduct, but because it illustrates the range of choices even the most ideologically committed women within the Nazi leadership's inner circle faced as the regime collapsed around them, and how differently those choices played out for the children caught in the middle. Lina's successful pension litigation, moreover, was not an entirely isolated case. Other widows of senior Nazi officials pursued similar claims through the West German courts during the same general period, citing comparable technical arguments about their husband's formal civil service or military rank at the time of death, arguments that proved successful often enough to establish a broader, uncomfortable pattern within the young Federal Republic's legal system. Gerda Bormann, widow of Hitler's private secretary Martin Bormann, had died of illness shortly after the war and never lived to pursue such a claim herself, but other officials' widows found the West German pension bureaucracy, bound by narrow statutory categories rather than any broader test of moral desert, similarly receptive to their claims in the years that followed. Jewish organizations and Holocaust survivor groups periodically protested these rulings when they came to public attention, arguing that a state built on the explicit rejection of Nazism should not be legally compelled to underwrite the comfortable retirement of the regime's beneficiaries, but the narrow technical nature of German pension law and the broader political reluctance within the young Federal Republic to reopen sweeping questions about individual culpability that had already been formally addressed, if inadequately, through the denazification process, meant that these protests rarely succeeded in altering the underlying legal outcomes. Lina Heydrich's case, precisely because of her husband's outsized historical notoriety, became one of the most visible and most frequently cited examples of this broader pattern, ensuring that her name remained linked, decades after the war's end, not only to the Holocaust itself, but to the specific and ongoing failures of post-war Germany's efforts to fully reckon with its recent past. How many more decades might Lina Heydrich have continued this pattern of advocacy and denial had she lived longer than her 74 years? It is a question without an answer, but one worth posing given the remarkable consistency of her public conduct across the 4 full decades separating her husband's assassination from her own death in 1985. She showed no evident signs of softening her position as she aged, no late-life reconsideration of the historical record, no acknowledgement, even privately, to close confidants. that the mountain of documentary evidence assembled by historians like Robert Goworth and others might warrant some reassessment of the fairy tale narrative she had spent so long constructing. Instead, she remained, until her final days on the island of her birth, precisely the woman she had chosen to become in the aftermath of her husband's death. An unrepentant, articulate, and remarkably persistent defender of a man whose name remains, to this day, synonymous with the cold, bureaucratic machinery of genocide. How is Lina Heydrich remembered today, more than 4 decades after her death and more than 8 decades after her husband's assassination? Her name persists primarily within the specialized literature devoted to the senior leadership of the Third Reich and their families, appearing in biographies of Reinhard Heydrich, in broader studies of women's complicity within the Nazi system, and in the occasional documentary or journalistic retrospective that revisits the Wannsee Conference, the assassination of Heydrich, or the broader question of how Nazi Germany's perpetrators were or were not held accountable in the post-war decades. Nancy Doherty's posthumously published biography brought renewed attention to her story in the early 2020s, prompting a fresh round of reviews and reassessments that largely concluded, as historians before them had, that Lina's own account of her life required significant skepticism and correction against the documentary record. Her memoir remains a curious primary source for researchers, valuable precisely because of what it reveals about the psychology of denial and self-justification among those who benefited from Nazi rule, even as its factual claims about the broader course of the Holocaust require careful and often skeptical handling. Visitors to Fehmarn today will find little in the way of formal memorialization connected to Lina Heydrich, the island having largely moved on to its modern identity as a tourist destination known for windsurfing, beaches, and the bridge connecting it to the German mainland. A stark contrast to its brief mid-century notoriety as the childhood home and eventual refuge of one of the Third Reich's most defiant, unrepentant widows. In the Czech Republic, by contrast, the site of Panenské Břežany has attracted more sustained historical attention, particularly from researchers and memorial organizations documenting the Flossenburg subcamp system and the broader landscape of Nazi occupation across Bohemia and Moravia, ensuring that the estate's darker history as a site of forced labor has not been entirely erased, even as the buildings themselves fell into decades of institutional neglect and repurposing. So, after tracing the full arc of her extraordinary and deeply troubling life, what did Lina Heydrich actually do all day? The honest answer is that it depended entirely on which decade and which version of her story one chooses to believe. As a teenager on Fehmarn, she rode, attended dances, and absorbed the political resentments of a defeated post-war Germany. As a young SD wife in the early 1930s, she managed a household on a shoestring budget while her husband built an intelligence apparatus out of a shoebox of index cards. As the wife of a rising Berlin power broker through the later 1930s, she raised children, hosted dinners, navigated the petty rivalries of the SS elite, and rode horses and played croquet with a husband who, by his own wife's account, treated relaxation with the same disciplined intensity he brought to his professional duties. As the mistress of a stolen Bohemian estate during the war's final years, her days blended the domestic and the monstrous in equal measure, managing children and household staff in the morning and, according to multiple survivor accounts, mistreating enslaved labourers in the afternoon. And across the 4 decades of her long widowhood, she spent an extraordinary proportion of her waking hours constructing, defending, and publicly repeating a version of her own history that minimized her husband's crimes, denied the scale of the Holocaust itself, and painted her own domestic existence as one of blissful ignorance rather than active, if partial, complicity. Lina Heydrich's case exemplifies in many ways the broader complexities and failures of the post-war reckoning with Nazi Germany, a reckoning in which the perpetrators most directly associated with mass murder, particularly male officials who could be tied through documentary evidence to specific orders and operations, faced at least some measure of formal justice, while the wider circle of individuals, spouses, household staff, and administrative enablers who made that machinery of murder function on a daily basis often escaped meaningful accountability entirely. She never fired a weapon, never signed a deportation order, and never sat in a room where the fate of millions was decided in the cold, bureaucratic language of the Wannsee Protocol. But she joined the party before her husband did, pushed him toward the career that would make him one of history's great mass murderers, benefited from every privilege and every stolen property that career generated, and when finally given direct personal authority over people the regime had condemned, allegedly chose cruelty over even the most basic decency. Her life poses, with unusual clarity, one of the central and still unresolved questions of Holocaust historiography. How should history judge those who stood not at the center of the killing machinery, but immediately adjacent to it, who benefited from its fruits, who occasionally participated in its smaller cruelties, and who spent the rest of their lives insisting they had simply been housewives, mothers, and bystanders to history rather than participants in it? There is something quietly haunting about the way Lina Heydrich's life traced a near-perfect circle, beginning and ending on the same small island in the Baltic Sea. The Fehmarn of her childhood, with its rowing clubs, its modest schoolteacher's cottage, and its sweeping views across the strait toward Denmark, gave way to the grandeur and horror of Berlin, Munich, and occupied Prague, only to return decades later to that same stretch of coastline once the war and its aftermath had run their course. The island that had once represented nothing more than the ordinary backdrop of a provincial German girlhood became, by the end of her life, both a refuge and a kind of open-air museum to her own carefully curated version of history, a place where former SS officers could gather over meals at her restaurant to reminisce about an era Lina insisted, against all documented evidence, had been fundamentally misunderstood by the world. Fehmarn asked nothing of her in return for this refuge. It simply remained, as it always had, a quiet island of beaches, farmland, and fishing villages, indifferent to the extraordinary and terrible history that had passed through the life of one of its own daughters. In the end, the question posed at the start of this video, what did Lina Heydrich actually do all day, resists any single tidy answer. And that resistance is itself the most important lesson her life offers. She was, across the 90 years of documented human experience, represented by her birth in 1911 and her death in 1985, by turns an ordinary schoolgirl, an eager young convert to a murderous political movement, a devoted and resourceful fiancée, a harried young mother managing a household alone through her husband's long absences, the mistress of a stolen mansion who allegedly abused the enslaved people forced to work its grounds, a grieving widow demanding vengeance for her son's accidental death, a shrewd litigant who forced a reluctant state to fund her comfortable retirement, an innkeeper serving nostalgic old Nazis their dinner, a prolific correspondent and memoirist defending an indefensible legacy, and finally, an old woman on a quiet island, still insisting, until her last breath, that the Holocaust had been little more than a fairy tale. No single label captures the totality of those decades, and that, perhaps, is precisely the point. Lina Heydrich's life demonstrates with uncomfortable clarity how ordinary the daily texture of complicity can look from the inside, how easily the routines of motherhood, hospitality and household management can coexist in the very same afternoon with proximity to and participation in some of the worst crimes in human history, and how, given 4 more decades to construct and refine a comfortable story about it all, a person can go to their grave still convinced that they were simply misunderstood. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this deep dive into the extraordinary and deeply unsettling life of Lina Heydrich informative. She was a woman who spent her days moving fluidly between the roles of devoted mother, ambitious political spouse, estate manager, alleged abuser of enslaved labourers, and, for more than 4 decades after her husband's death, one of the most persistent and unrepentant defenders of a man responsible for organising the machinery of the Holocaust. If you enjoyed learning about the hidden domestic world behind one of the Third Reich's most feared figures, make sure to check out our video on what happened to the wives of Nazi leaders after World War II, where you can see how Lina's story compares to the post-war fates of Emmy Goering, Ilse Hess, Margarete Himmler, and the other women who shared her strange and troubling social circle. You might also want to watch our video on what happened to the children of Nazi leaders after World War II, which follows figures like Haida, Silke, and Marte Heydrich, along with the sons and daughters of other senior Nazi officials, into the difficult decades that followed the war. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one.